Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to have someone who's way overdue to come onto the podcast, and that's Gaurav Kapoor from MetricStream. So, Gaurav, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you, Tom, and very glad to be on the podcast. Like you said, delighted to be here given the coverage that you've done over the many years. Heard a lot about you and, from my other colleagues as well. So thank you.
So, could you give us your professional background leading up to your work at MetricStream?
Absolutely, Tom. So I'll keep it brief, Tom. I am one of the co-founders of MetricStream. We started this company, a couple of decades ago, and with a whole view and inspiration about how to get different lines of defense, even within the second line, how to get different themes of risk like, operational risk, audit, compliance, third party management, cybersecurity, all under the same umbrella. And I started out as a founding CFO of the company, then became the chief operating officer during our growth years. And for about 3.5 years, I was also the CEO of the company. More recently, with the entire, kind of transformation that's happening in the market around AI, I've taken on the role of the vice chairman. We got a very, very strong CEO to partner with us essentially. And most of my focus right now is going to be is on customers because we have to stay very intimate with the customers at this stage, particularly given the disruption that's happening in the AI market. Yeah. Prior to that, Tom, I'll just wrap up saying that prior to that, I spent about a decade, just short of a decade, at Citigroup in different capacities, running business lines in the retail side, including it wasn't called fintech at that time, but being one of the first payment internet consumer remittance payment companies, that we had founded, okay, as part of Citi. So that's my quick, short background there.
So, you have a statement that July is a critical time and even an inflection point for compliance and risk management. I have tried to argue that 2025 is indeed an entire inflection point, but why do you see July as even more specific an inflection point, Gaurav?
Tom, the way I'll answer that is that distinctively the pace, velocity of risk, and I'm using risk as a broad theme, has changed dramatically over the last couple of years. You look at what's happened in the first 6 months of the year here globally, whether it is the geopolitical landscape, you look at the accelerated environment of risk that's happening across, supply chains. You look at what's happening with cyber, okay, where in some cases, state-sponsored cyber attacks have been on the rise. You look at what's happening on the people front, competitiveness, because of the advent of AI. Every week you see, larger companies launching something, and that creates competitive risk for the others, right? So as you look at all this, the classic mid-year review, okay, and July is a mid-year for most companies, becomes a strategic opportunity for companies to assess any deviations, recalibrate, access blind spots, that was revealed in the first half. So the world of what I call annual assessments and making sure that you're doing strategic planning annually, okay, is not relevant anymore. A quarter might be too short, but the middle of the year gives a true reflection of what has happened in the first half of the year, and then start to recalibrate and reprioritize what companies need to do. That's why it's a natural time for people to look at it.
One of the other reasons I was so intrigued to visit with you, Gaurav, was you mentioned it in your opening, and that's the use of AI. Where do you see, or maybe even broader, how does MetricStream see the use of AI in the greater GRC space at this point?
Tom, so that's a great question. In fact, we made a very strong statement about 2 months ago, okay, on the whole movement of GRC, to be plugging in AI. There are two parts to this. One, distinctively what we call AI for GRC. And there, what we have done is that we've taken a very strong stand that if you look at the biggest pain points, we can talk all day long about LLMs and about SLMs and about MCPs and all the technological language that's coming out. But our mission and purpose after looking at and talking to hundreds of our customers is to make life easier for them. Okay, GRC is pained by the volume of activity, form filling, workflows, reporting that happens in our world, essentially. So we have taken a stand that we want to make their lives simpler. And through a combination of generative and agentic AI, how do you automate? How do you provide insights? How do you provide decision making capabilities, right? But make the lives of end users much easier. My theory, and it's a calculated theory, is that there's over 500 million people in the world who actually actively use GRC. And we can provide all the backup for that. 500 million people, that's several countries combined under one umbrella. And these people, day in and day out, they're filling up compliance form, risk forms, okay, cyber assessments, third-party assessments, all of that stuff. And AI presents a very unique opportunity right now to be able to provide a lot more efficiency in the process, okay, where a lot of the rote work can be done, by agents. But on top of that, you still need immense amount of human insights. These are all people who are practitioners, have worked, for very long in their own functions, understand the business well. But just think about it, how much time they're spending on rote activity. So that's the primary kind of agenda we have. After that, along with that, we have developed several use cases to be able to aid the compliance professional, the risk professional, third party, to be able to provide more strategic insights into how they need to make decisions. That makes it more easy. And last thing I'll say is that if you look at, and you've been in this industry for a long time, Tom, if you look at it, the world has centered on sampling. Okay, I'm just using a word, sampling. Now, what AI does is it allows you to increase the canvas of coverage immensely. Okay, so instead of sampling, you can do 100%, what I call coverage in terms of what kind of activities you're looking at, even the emerging risks, basically, that have not typically been tackled by GRC in the past. So I would say, in summary, it's making the end users' lives a lot easier by removing the rote activity. It's increasing the canvas of coverage, essentially. Okay. And third thing is providing real insights to be able to make decisions faster.
Let me pick up on that last point and with your words, emerging risk. Because one of the things that excites me about AI, agentic AI, and Gen AI for GRC is we can actually move to, I don't want to say risk prediction, but risk preparation, where a CEO might come to you and say, I want 5 scenarios of risk management strategy for X events. Or if your supply chain in Central Africa is disrupted by a civil war, what are you going to do? Or you name the risk, geopolitical, weather, doesn't matter to me. But that's the speed at which I see AI can bring to an overall risk management strategy. And I'm going to use risk management to speak of all categories of risk in that broader context. Would that be a fair assessment of where you see this going as well, Gaurav?
Absolutely, Tom. And I'll actually bring it to life, hopefully, with an example from the recent like few months. Okay. I absolutely believe, and that's what I call the canvas of coverage, Tom, right? The canvas of coverage goes beyond the traditional, here's my regulations, here's the top-down view of where my risks are, etc. It increases the canvas of coverage based on events, based on, and events could range from, like you pointed out, a disruption, a civil, war happening in some country. How do you change your supply chain? Let me bring it to life with a couple of examples there, right? We are working with one of the largest oil and gas companies where we have deployed their classic enterprise risk management, Sarbanes-Oxley audit, regulatory compliance, cyber, etc. About 4 or 5 months ago, they came and they've created a group called Global Risk Management that goes beyond the classic enterprise risk management, where this oil and gas company is exposed to a significant number of what I call risks that are beyond the classic coverage of ERM. For example, they have attacks that are happening both physical and logical on their oil rigs here, right? They have they have executives who travel to strike-prone countries where there could be physical ransomware risk possibilities here. They have a million devices, endpoint devices that they have to provide coverage for it, right? They are facing these same challenges on trade tariffs, for example, right? They are operating in over 100 countries globally. They have actually joint ventures with hundreds of companies, literally hundreds of companies. If you look at this, there is absolutely no way in the traditional realm of things on being able to aggregate, have observations coming in from different places, unless we really use AI. Now, I will also caution, AI is not the magical answer, because you also have to have the plumbing. Where is this data coming from? How do you contextualize this data? How do you contextualize this information? If there is, a war happening in a certain place, how does it truly impact, right? So the plumbing, Tom, has to be very strong to be able to make AI work, but it opens up a real possibility in changing the paradigm of how organizations are thinking about risk. I'll tell you the last thing. My wife, okay, and I'm bringing this personally home. She runs product development and supply chain for one of the largest American apparel brands here. Okay. I see it at home that one trade tariff from Bangladesh going up to 30% can shift the entire, can start pushing the buttons on shifting the entire supply chain to another direction, right? They're dealing in Latin America, they're dealing with, countries that are across the world. And these countries are not just about trade tariffs, they're also exposed to some of the wars that are happening here, right? Globally. So it's a dynamically shifting, kind of what I call both supply chain, but risk spectrum, if you will. And it has changed, Tom, in the last couple of years. It has changed. And AI does help because it allows it, but the plumbing is very important as well.
The plumbing is very important, and the oversight or the human in the loop, I would say, is equally important. Thoughts on that?
Yes, Tom, the human in the loop. See, a lot of people are making statements that job losses, etc., will happen. But I do feel that the human in the loop is absolutely important. It'll just raise the quality of the work that people are doing, from doing rote work, like I said earlier, to the human intelligence that has to be layered on top here. The last thing, Tom, that I didn't mention is there's also an emergence in AI on the reverse. I mentioned about AI for GRC. Okay, there's also GRC for AI. So the whole component of how companies need to govern their AI infrastructure, from observability to, call it data privacy, to explainability, it is becoming very important because both regulators, but also internal executives, IT teams, they can slow this down, the adoption in GRC, because unlike sales and marketing function, in GRC, one miss can cause you $100 million fine, right? So people are more cautious, but the governance has to keep speed. So I like to call it balancing innovation with trust, essentially. That's going to continue to be very important, both infrastructurally, but also the way companies set up their culture.
Let me turn to, you mentioned that you have stepped away from the presidency or CEO role to the chairman. So,
Vice chairman.
vice chairman. So,
Yeah.
I'd like to focus on that level. And if you were counseling a chairman or a vice chairman, or indeed an entire board, on their role in this process, because not many people are talking about that as yet. So, how do you help counsel a board, a chairman of the board, or a vice chairman on their role in this change in the management of risk?
So Tom, that's a great question. And let me layer this in a couple of ways, right? First is, depending on the industry and the size of the company, the guidance is going to be slightly different, right? Are you trying to protect an asset? Are you trying to grow an asset? Right? There are companies in different industries that have supremely high competitive risk, for example. Some are lesser exposed to competitive risk. So the dimensions of how you kind of recommend to a board or to executives is slightly different here. Let me take a couple of examples, right? So first thing I would say is that almost imperatively, sizing of where you are and what you want to be is going to be critical. Okay. Like I said, are you in a competitive market that is looking for hyper growth? Are you a company in an industry that's trying to protect yourself? The dimensions of risk and the risk appetite start to change. Then there has to be a framework of what I call strategic risk that is different from classic enterprise risk here. Enterprise risk, in my opinion, is more defensive. Okay. The new world of strategic risk has to be a combination of defense and offense both. Yeah. Third thing I would say is, once you have that, you start to look at, where do I want to focus on? Okay, in terms of, like, if you take my own example, right? We realize that AI can disrupt this market. So in 2 years, we'll either be really strong on the AI journey, or we could get disrupted by younger players or even larger players for that matter, right? So we had to make a call that, okay, our time and attention is going to go on this. Basically, we have to get more customer intimate. That's a true risk, a true strategic risk for a company like MetricStream, right? So where you deploy the resources is going to be supremely critical. And last thing I would say is that it becomes even more imperative this whole world of what I call integrated risk management or integrated GRC, where you start to tie in different functions, different groups, because the pace and velocity is so high that a simple compliance or regulatory risk can become strategic risk if you don't tackle it, yeah, right? So it's a layered kind of approach. What is your appetite and who are you? Number two, where you deploy the key resources, and make sure that the focus is high. Third thing is set up the infrastructure on risk so that you can continuously manage to know how your performance is measuring against risk. I don't know if, Tom, that answers the question, but that's what I'm talking to a lot of our executives in our customer base.
That's actually the best answer to that question I have gotten. That
Thank
was
you.
excellent. Let me turn to the second half of 2025. You said that now might be a good time for reflection or inflection, but what are some of the top concerns you have for the rest of the year, or perhaps some of the top initiatives you see MetricStream in?
So Tom, if I take just a surge where a surge of requests or a surge of interest is coming, I would say that if I look at the top risks, right, distinctively, cybersecurity and data protection, especially AI powered attacks and surface area expansion, okay, and third party exposure linked to cyber is clearly top of mind right now. Not just because of the events, but also with more and more digitization happening, whether it's cryptos, whether it's AI, all of that stuff, right? You are seeing, an increased what I call awareness and desire to protect that risk. The second thing, which is more recent, okay, but really taken the world by storm, is what I'm calling geopolitical and macroeconomic instability, supply chains, where you want to put your investments. Regulatory pressures are also changing, based on the geopolitical and macroeconomic instability, right? You look at a large organization, there's a move towards even nationalization of data, right? You look at countries like Russia, look at India, look at China, look at even some of the smaller countries in the Middle East. Okay, you are seeing a move towards nationalization. Okay, and that's changing the IT paradigm of some of the companies and how they're operating it, right? As an example. So that's the second part. Yeah. The third one is, I would say, interestingly, and you're sitting in Texas, Tom. Okay, and I won't make any political statement, but climate and extreme weather is now starting to impact, or it has impacted always, okay, business operations of organizations there, right? Now, it is a politically, weighted statement. I don't want to go on one side or the other side, but the fact is that it is really impacting it, right? The Texas problem that just happened at scale, you look at some of the other climate changes that are happening. Now, have organizations figured out how to tackle that? Probably not, but the awareness is there. And this is not a short term impact. You can't take certain steps and solve the weather problem tomorrow. It is more long term, it's more strategic. So that we are hearing that their core business operations are getting impacted. Last thing I would say, Tom, is what I'm going to call perennial, not just in the next 6 months, but it's high focus. Regulatory shifts that are happening tied to emerging technologies are going to remain a constant. Okay, but they are high intensity right now, especially in the second half of the year, with more regulations coming on from the EU AI Act, or how US is thinking about crypto. You saw the regulatory kind of changes that happened in the last couple of days, on the crypto regulations. For example, the intent is to deregulate, but to regulate, if you know what I'm saying, and requiring constant what I call vigilance across these parameters are going to be important. So again, if I had to tie it down, there are so many other things here, Tom, but cybersecurity and data protection, geopolitical and macroeconomic, climate and weather, okay, and regulatory shifts that are happening, particularly around emerging technologies, are probably the first thing that people are most worried about. Also, because some of the others are known knowns there. Okay, these are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Okay, if you will, in the spectrum 2 by 2 matrix of known and unknown, right? That's why people are worried about, and they're grappling as well. But there's all good human minds attached to how to solve this.
My hometown is Kerrville, Texas, and that's where the July 4th flood hit. So I'm very aware of your comments on the weather. And for the first time, I've had to consider, what do you do if not only your entire business is wiped out? What does the county do when $18 billion worth of businesses are wiped out? So it's ever changing. I have tried to advocate that compliance needs to broaden its focus or broaden out to risk. And I've tried to argue to compliance professionals that the various types of risks we need to move compliance into risk, and we need to indeed move all other areas into risk. But you have articulated or talk about the evolving role of the chief risk officer and compliance heads. I think it's important because of really everything you've said, the evolving nature of risk. Is there a way that we can move the various areas of risk, even that you've talked about, geopolitical, weather, tariffs, economic, legal and regulatory? Can we move that into a broader category of risk and use these same tools, strategies, and tactics, or do you advocate something else, Gaurav?
Tom, great question. I think first thing I'll say is that this shift from what you're calling checkbox compliance to a more risk aware and resilient culture is no longer theoretical. And it's interesting. If you look at the stakeholders we as business owners or business people, have to cater to, they are regulators, there are shareholders, there are employees. Okay, all three have to be catered to. And what I would say is that if you look at the recent trends in the last couple of years, for the first time, regulators are coming in and saying that it's not just about regulation. They're using a word called resilience. We look at the PRA, look at the DORA Act in Germany. What does it, if you peel the onion, they're basically saying, Tom, that it's not just about checkbox compliance. We need to know how your operational risk is tied to your cyber risk, is tied to your business continuity, is tied to your third party management, as an example, and of course, regulatory compliance, right? We want you to show us that you're not just thinking about a checkbox compliance, but the resilience of the entire organization underlying all these facets and themes of risk, if you will, right? So, what I would say is that, and by the way, the volatility, the complexity, the stakeholder scrutiny that we're talking about, that is just pushing companies to think beyond, beyond compliance towards risk. And one other example I'll give you, Tom, is if you look at a very finite persona called the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. They started as security professionals. They moved to becoming compliance professionals for cyber. And guess what? Right now, many of the CISOs are actually folding into risk organizations because the board doesn't understand the concept of 100 security risks and 1,000 vulnerabilities. They understand risk is medium, low, high, even quantifying the risk so that they can make decisions faster versus having to process the whole thing, right? So this move, in every function is happening from, let's say, security to compliance to risk, basically. Same thing in the operational risk world or the audit world. In the audit world, people used to think they're third line of defense. Now, chief auditors are sitting on the strategy table of companies saying that maybe we can take a little more risk here, okay, to power up the business. That's fantastic, the transformation, right? So, in summary, Tom, is being driven. Now, you can choose a word risk or you can choose the word resilience. Resilience is a little more defensive. Okay, risk is more offensive, if you will. Offensive in the sense, risk, people take risk, they can take more risk to accelerate the top line as well. But overall, okay, I would say that you said it well, that moving from the checkbox to a culture of resilience and risk is where the market is moving towards.
Rob, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you or find out any more information on MetricStream or the topics we've touched on in this podcast, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Tom, very simple. One is our general, what I call box comes to info@metricstream.com. And I'm a pretty hands-on executive, if you will. So people can also directly send it to me. It's my first name, Gaurav @metricstream.com.
Rob, I wanted to thank you again. As I said at the start, you're way too overdue to come on this podcast. I hope the next time will not be as long.
No, thank you, Tom, for the good questions, and also stay safe. You're in a location that has been compromised recently, but please stay safe, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet. Every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.